The most popular sports in Canada in the 1920s were boat racing, hockey, boxing, rowing, basketball, track and field, football, lacrosse, wrestling, tennis, golf, and swimming. Baseball was a very popular sport in the 1920s, so popular in fact that it could easily be compared to hockey's popularity in the 1920s. Baseball became so popular that several players from Japan immigrated to Canada just to play. Basketball was a popular sport for men and women in the 1920s. It became so popular because of the large number of unemployed men who took up basketball to deal with their boredom. Basketball was one of the first sports that showed an equality between men and women in sports because of a Canadian female team called the Edmonton Grads who won 4 gold medals for basketball at an Olympic Games. In the 1920s, hockey was a sport that became very popular very quickly in Canada. As hockey's popularity increased rapidly, Canada started to call hockey their national game. After World War I, hockey quickly became the most popular sport in Canada because just about every Canadian enjoyed watching or playing hockey. Many players were injured because of the lack of equipment they had, especially the goalies who did not have any helmets. Hockey is now considered part of the Canadian culture because of its popularity in the 1920s. Boat racing and rowing were fairly common sports of the 1920s. Though they were not as popular as baseball, basketball, or hockey, many people still enjoyed watching and racing themselves. The Bluenose was a very popular racing boat that was built in 1921. This boat was originally a fishing boat, but then was recognized for its racing abilities. Boxing was a very popular international sport in the 1920s. This was one of the first sports in which Canada competed against other countries on a regular basis. The equipment that fighters used was limited, and so were the rules, so there were a lot more injuries in boxing in the 1920s than now. Canadian football and Canadian lacrosse were not extremely popular sports in the 1920s. Most Canadians were drawn towards basketball, baseball, and hockey. Because of the low popularity of football and lacrosse, there were not enough funds to purchase proper equipment. Many players went without pads or helmets. The sticks that lacrosse players used had a much larger net to catch the ball in than today. This net was eventually made smaller and smaller over time. Tennis, golf, and swimming were also not very popular sports in the 1920s. Tennis and golf were more for the wealthy men who used their own money to buy the equipment. Swimming was a competitive sport that was more in the Olympics than anywhere else. The crowds at these events were usually fairly small because people are usually asked to keep silent at these events, but most of the Canadians wanted to be loud and cheer for their team or players. Finally, a fairly popular sport or event in the 1920s was car racing. The cars in the 1920s were long and thin with an opening closer to the back where the driver would sit. The front 2 wheels were generally smaller than the back to raise the driver so they would be able to see better. Racing was a very expensive sport because most men had to buy parts and make their own or buy their own car. The vehicles that were raced generally did not have very good steering, so it was not uncommon for a car to crash into a tree or the sidelines.